Hello again. If I've timed this right, this video will be the first released after the long series I've just completed on the Book of Common Prayer, 7-part series, which if you have a few hours, maybe go back and look at that. But we're going to depart from the Book of Common Prayer, for the most part, for a brief look at a few other things of interest. While I was otherwise occupied making common prayer videos, I received a few packages in the mail from Joe St. Eggbenedictus, and I have been neglectful in showing some of the things he sent. He knows I'm a fan of pencils. There's a couple of really neat old classic Star Wars pencils here, and some festive Christmas pencils. Thank you for that. But that's the last cheery thing we're going to be discussing. Okay, not the last, because I forgot. This is probably my favorite thing, even more than the pencils. This terrific Peanuts eraser, because I love Lucy. So thank you, Joe. But one of the other things that he sent in one of the care packages is this fascinating book that I want to talk about today, The Standard Manual for Funeral Occasions. Let me just say right off the bat, I was way more excited to get this book than any healthy person should ever be. This is fascinating to me, and I'm so grateful to Joe for sending this. It's a subject that obviously we all think about and will all eventually have to think about, but to spend a lot of time kind of perusing the inner workings of I guess an industry or a part of the human experience that we only briefly glimpse, just to look at it kind of an insider look, is just absolutely fascinating. And I love this book. I think this is a terrific and interesting book. And yeah, thank you, Joe, for sending this. I'm going to go through it just briefly and not belabor the point too much, but some things I just wanted to point out. So as the name implies, what this is a handbook on conducting funeral services. And it's intended for a Christian audience, assuming that the deceased is Christian, at least nominally. And it starts out with an introduction that gives, among other things, a history of casket making and embalming and other maybe somewhat morbid fields of study, but then moves quickly right into the nuts and bolts, and it covers aspects of funeral services that I had never thought of, and maybe you haven't either, from the physics and the physical acts of the service. Whose jurisdiction is what in terms of the minister versus the funeral director? Where does the minister stand? Who leads the procession into the church or the funeral home, etc.? What's the appropriate clothing to wear? Before you even get to specifics about choosing readings from Scripture or appropriate hymns or perhaps poems to read. So there's a long discussion at the beginning about just kind of how it's all set up, who's responsible for what, what's a minister's role, what's the funeral director's role, and then it talks about the funeral sermon, And more on that later, because there's a long section here with some sermon outlines for appropriate sermons that I imagine would be really useful if you were a minister and called on to perform, let's say several funerals in short succession. There are lots of outlines of sermons here that you could borrow from to compose a sermon. But there's some interesting advice here for preparing and delivering a sermon at a funeral that I thought was interesting. As to style, the funeral sermon should be delivered in the very best language at the minister's command. There should be no straining for ornateness of expression or rhetorical flourishes, but the occasion does demand careful phrasing and good diction. There should be no crudities of speech or defects of grammar to mar the effectiveness of that comfort one seeks to bring to his fellows. Good advice. There's a long section here, Comfort from Scriptures, which for a book that's, it's non-sectarian. As far as I can tell, it's not associated with any particular denomination or any brand of Christian spirituality. It's Christian in tone, but this long section is worth reading. I found it fascinating. I read through it entirely once, and I've read sections of it since then. It's a meditation on the 23rd Psalm. So it breaks up the 23rd Psalm into these little phrases, and then there are multiple scripture portions related to that idea. For instance, the Lord is my shepherd. And then there's a section here from Isaiah 40. He shall feed his flock like a shepherd. He shall gather the lambs with his arm and carry them in his bosom, and shall gently lead those that are with young. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and know my sheep, and am known of mine, etc., from the Gospel of John. And then the section, I shall not want, and there are several scripture portions related to that, in green pastures, and several scripture portions related to that. It's a tremendous study on grief and comfort, and it's just well worth a read, just hidden away in this funeral director's book, which I think is fascinating. Worth the price of admission just for this interesting study on the 23rd Psalm. After the comfortable words from Scripture, there are some poems that may be appropriate for including. Longfellow, Browning, William Cullen Bryant. There's some famous poets represented here and famous poems that you would recognize, Oliver Wendell Holmes, etc. So there's a lot of those that you could pick and choose from. Then there are hymns appropriate for a funeral service. Lots of those. And then this long section of sermon outlines that I mentioned already. There then is a separate section for the graveside service, the committal sentences for speaking by the minister at the graveside. And I like that this first section is from the Book of Common Prayer. So it all comes back to the Book of Common Prayer on this channel. And then there's a section for recording dates of funerals performed. So whoever owned this book either never used it or just didn't record the sermons or the funerals at which he was ministering. And then this section, which is morbidly fascinating to me, my own funeral notes. So I don't know if that's my own notes about funerals or notes for my own funeral. I guess it's subject to interpretation, but really probably the most interesting book I've received in probably years, and I'm really grateful to Joe for sending this. And I will use this just as a meditation I don't think it's morbid. I'm not decrepitly elderly or anything of the sort, but um, thinking about one's own mortality, there's nothing horribly morbid about that. But even apart from thoughts of mortality, just an interesting read. So thank you, Joe, for that. Standard Manual for Funeral Occasions. And then just by way of comparison, I want to look at this book I've owned for years that is produced for my own denomination, the Church of the Nazarene. It was compiled by a general superintendent, which would be like an archbishop, I guess, for our denomination. And it's basically church rituals, a handbook for various services of the church. So things that you would find in the second half of the Book of Common Prayer, for instance, that for an Anglican, those services are here in a book intended for Nazarenes. So it starts with baptism, baptism of infants. That's an interesting section because there are probably Nazarenes that are surprised that that's even a thing for Nazarenes, but it is. It's allowable, just not done much anymore. Various things here. Obviously, what I want to go to is the funeral service. And we have a very small section, burial of the dead, 7-8 pages of basically one funeral service. That's a guide here for performing this one service that seems to borrow heavily also from the Book of Common Prayer, but with updated language, so maybe they were basing it loosely on the 1979 prayer book. I'm not certain of that, but lacks certainly a lot of the depth and the wide variety of choices of this book. This non-sectarian, non-denominational handbook has just way more information. And I know that's not the sole purpose of this book, but it just seems sorely lacking in any type of depth in at least the funeral service. So maybe I'm judging too harshly, but this book focuses on one event in the life, I guess the life of a Christian. One event. This book is all the events that punctuate the life of a Christian: baptism, Lord's Supper, marriage, burial of the dead, and then there are dedication services for churches. There are, I believe, pastoral care. Thought it had the ordination rituals, but it does not. That's in the Nazarene manual, but covers various events that are discrete events in the life of a Christian. I told you it all comes back to the Book of Common Prayer. The Book of Common Prayer, when I am laid to rest, maybe I'll write this in the notes here for my own funeral. I want the presiding minister to be using the Book of Common Prayer because I want to have lived a life that is not just punctuated by some Christian events or the comfortable words from Scripture weren't an afterthought that were thrown in by a minister reading from this book, but the Book of Common Prayer is a way to structure your life from birth to death, and that's part of what draws me so much to it. It's a handbook for life, in coordination with the Bible, which it's always pointing back to. So I guess what I'm trying to say is these books are useful in knowing how to commemorate the life of a Christian. The Book of Common Prayer is useful for teaching one how to live the life of a Christian, how to live the life of a Christian. There are other ways to do it, but in terms of a manual for living one's life, the Holy Bible and the Book of Common Prayer, you could do a lot worse. So anyway, that I had to bring in the Book of Common Prayer somewhere. So one more time, thank you, Joe, for this fascinating book. This is something I will probably keep until it's needed at the end of my own life. But I think, again, I think the service, hopefully the minister presiding will be holding a copy of the Book of Common Prayer at that time. Thanks for joining me for this maybe somewhat morbid video, and maybe the next video I make, I will try to have 0 references to the Book of Common Prayer. We'll see how that goes. Maybe you'll join me then.